Deadly secret. Muslim wife's affair with father-in-law unravels in tragic true crime twist. Hook. What happens when betrayal, guilt, and a dark secret collide? Watch as a woman's life spirals out of control, surviving the ultimate betrayal, facing the truth, and fighting to escape the consequences of her choices. But is it too late for redemption? You won't believe the shocking twist that changes everything. Stay till the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Miriam sat on the edge of the couch, eyes fixed on the door. Her fingers trembled as she toyed with the hem of her scarf. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the silence around her. The scent of incense filled the air, masking the unease that thickened like smoke in her lungs. She had always known this would come to an end, but she hadn't expected it to be like this. Outside, the wind howled, scraping against the windows, a constant reminder of the world outside her isolated bubble. Miriam's gaze shifted to the dark hallway. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the other side. They were coming. Her breath caught. Her mind raced with memories. The first time he smiled at her. The first touch. The stolen glances when no one was looking. The thrill, the guilt, the desire. Father-in-law. He was her husband's father, the man who should have been the patriarch of their family. Now he was her secret. A door creaked open. Miriam froze. Her pulse quickened as the shadow of a figure appeared in the doorway. His face was shadowed, but she knew who it was. She always knew. The father-in-law. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Miriam's breath hitched. He smiled at her, but it wasn't the same smile. It was darker. Dangerous. Are you ready? His voice was low, too low, sending shivers down her spine. She didn't answer. Her body stiffened, her mind screaming at her to stop this madness. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The door slammed shut behind him. Miriam couldn't move. Her body betrayed her. In the dim light, she saw the glint of something in his hand. A knife. Her heart stopped. No, she thought. This wasn't part of the plan, but it was too late. Before she could scream, the cold steel pressed against her skin. The silence came again, suffocating. And then nothing. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. Her breath came in short gasps, each one harder to take than the last. His hand, firm on her shoulder, held her in place. She could feel the cold metal of the knife against her skin, its edge grazing her throat. His lips were inches from her ear, his breath hot and rancid. You didn't think I would let you go, did you? His whisper was chilling, cutting through the stillness. Miriam's mind was racing, thoughts tangled in panic. How had it come to this? How had her life, once filled with routine and stability, turned into this nightmare? Her husband was downstairs, oblivious. She'd been so careful, but now it was all falling apart. The knife pressed harder. She could feel the pressure building, the sharp point teasing her skin, threatening to break through. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Miriam, he murmured, his voice soft, almost tender. You belong to me now. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight. But the fear paralyzed her. She had let it go too far. She had let him in, and now there was no way out. Her mind flashed to her husband, to the life she had before all of this started. The dinners, the laughter, the comfort of a simple life. It felt like a lifetime ago. And now, she was here, a prisoner in her own home. The man she had once trusted, the man who should have protected her, was now the one threatening her life. Her eyes blurred with tears. She closed her eyes, not wanting to see the man who had shattered everything. But the pressure on her neck increased. She couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was deafening. Her heart pounded harder, her vision dimming. It was too late to turn back. And just as she felt herself slipping into darkness, she heard something. A door slammed open. "Dad," a voice shouted. A familiar voice. Her husband's voice. Miriam's heart skipped a beat. Her husband stood at the doorway, eyes wide in disbelief. He was staring at his father, the man who had been her tormentor, holding the knife. For a moment, there was only stillness. The tension in the room thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, her husband lunged forward. The father-in-law barely had time to react before he was tackled to the ground. Miriam gasped for air, her hands instinctively clutching her throat as if to reassure herself that she was still alive. Her husband was shouting now, his voice frantic. But Miriam couldn't focus on the words. She could only hear the chaos, the sound of the struggle, the thud of fists on flesh, and the blood rushing in her ears. She felt her body tremble, the cold sweat on her skin mixing with the heat of her panic. And then it all stopped. The room fell silent again. Her husband was kneeling beside her, his hands shaking as he helped her to sit up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Miriam," he whispered, voice cracked. "Are you okay?" But Miriam couldn't answer. Her mind was still reeling from the shock, the terror of the last few minutes still fresh in her veins. Her eyes shifted to the lifeless figure of her father-in-law, sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around him. The knife was inches away from his hand. She felt no relief, no victory, only a deep, sinking feeling. And as her husband helped her to her feet, she couldn't help but wonder. Had she really escaped? Or was she now bound to a different kind of prison? Her legs were weak, as though they had forgotten how to stand. Her husband's hand on her arm was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The world felt unreal, distorted by the rush of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The silence in the room was suffocating. She glanced down at the father-in-law, his lifeless body on the floor, and her stomach turned. This was the man she had once thought she could trust, the man who had filled her world with a twisted sense of danger and forbidden desire. But now, he was nothing more than a broken corpse. Miriam's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape this house, this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere that could outrun the weight of what had just happened. Her husband's voice broke through the fog in her mind. "Why? Why did you?" His words faltered as he looked at her, searching her face for an answer that he was afraid to hear. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain? How could she tell him what had been hidden beneath their roof, beneath the facade of their marriage? Her mouth felt dry, her throat tight. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I was trapped." Her husband's face softened, but there was no comfort in it. His eyes were filled with something else now. Something darker. Disbelief. Anger. The betrayal lingered in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He glanced down at the body, his jaw clenched. "Miriam, this can't be undone," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His words felt like a punch to the gut. She had always known this day would come, but the finality of it hit her now, sharper than the knife that had nearly ended her life. She had no more excuses, no more lies. What was left for them? Her eyes flickered toward the door, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. "Miriam," her husband said, his voice breaking through the haze. What happens now?" She didn't know. For a moment, she wished everything would just end. But she wasn't sure if this was the end, or if it was just the beginning of something worse. The air felt thick with tension, heavier than before, as if the house itself had taken a breath and was now holding it in. Miriam's hands trembled as they clutched her husband's sleeve. His face, pale and strained, was a mirror of the chaos inside her. She didn't know how to answer him. What could she say? "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. I never meant for this. Her husband didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still locked on the body on the floor, his face twisted with disbelief. How could you? His voice was strained, tight with emotion. How long, Miriam? How long were you with him? She swallowed, trying to find the words, but they were caught in her throat. How could she explain something so twisted, so awful? Please, she begged, her voice breaking. Please don't look at me like that. He finally turned to face her, but his eyes were cold, distant. Not the eyes of the man who had loved her, who had trusted her. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. Miriam, we're married, he said, his voice low and sharp. And you betrayed me with my father. She felt as though the ground was slipping beneath her feet. His words sliced through her, each one more painful than the last. I never wanted this, she repeated, the words feeling hollow, as though they couldn't reach him anymore. He shook his head, his face hardening. How could I ever look at you the same again? How could I ever trust you? She stepped back, feeling the distance between them grow with every passing second. The room felt like it was closing in. Her husband's gaze flickered briefly to the knife, still on the floor, a cruel reminder of what had almost happened. His fists clenched at his sides, but his next words were barely a whisper. Did you ever love me? His question hung in the air, so quiet, so heavy, that she couldn't breathe. Miriam felt the weight of the question crashing down on her chest. Had she ever truly loved him? Or had the emptiness inside her led her down this path to destruction? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't answer. She couldn't lie to him again. She couldn't even lie to herself. Her husband stepped back, his eyes never leaving her face. The look in his eyes, betrayal, anger, confusion, shattered something deep inside her. The silence that followed felt deafening. It stretched on unbearable, as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he spoke again, voice cold and final. I can't do this anymore, Miriam. I can't live like this. Her heart stopped. He turned, not looking back as he walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the room. And then he was gone. The house was quiet again. The silence was unbearable. Miriam stood there, frozen, her whole body shaking. She was alone now, alone with her guilt, alone with the consequences of her actions, the reality of what she had done, what she had lost, crashed down on her all at once. The house felt smaller now, suffocating. What had she done? The man she had loved was gone. The man who had protected her, her husband, was gone. And the man she had betrayed him with was dead. She was left with nothing but the cold, empty house and the memories of a life she could never get back. The letter felt like a weight in her hand, heavier than the body of her father-in-law that still lay lifeless on the floor. The words burned into her mind, searing with the heat of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Asterisk, I know everything. Asterisk. Miriam's hands trembled so violently, she almost dropped the letter. Her eyes were glued to the ink, her mind unable to process the words. It was impossible, she thought. No one could know. But the message was clear. It was never over. The air felt suffocating now. The night outside seemed colder, the shadows stretching into the corners of her vision like fingers reaching for her. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat, like something was lurking just beyond her sight. Miriam's breath hitched. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Who had left this? Her husband? No, it couldn't be. He had walked away from her, leaving her to face the mess she had created. The shattered trust, the broken promises. Her mind raced. The weight of her past decisions pushed down on her chest, each breath more difficult than the last. But then, another thought. Could it be him? Her father-in-law? Was there something she had missed? A last message hidden in plain sight? Something she had overlooked? The idea made her stomach twist. No, she couldn't. She couldn't even think about it. But then why the letter? Why now? Miriam's gaze drifted to the floor, where the knife still lay, its handle gleaming in the dim light. It seemed to mock her, to remind her of everything that had gone wrong. She needed to act. She couldn't stay here any longer. But where could she go? The realization was sudden and sharp. She wasn't safe. Not in this house. Not anywhere. Her feet felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the ground with every step she took. Her mind spun with possibilities, none of them good, none of them leading to an escape. She quickly grabbed her scarf, wrapping it around her head, trying to steady her breath. Her heart still pounded, each beat threatening to send her into a panic. The walls seemed to close in as she moved toward the door, her fingers gripping the handle with desperation. But just as she was about to open it, the sound of footsteps outside froze her in place. Her breath caught. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't alone. Her first instinct was to hide, to run, but there was nowhere to hide, no way out. The door creaked open slowly, as though the person on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. Miriam's pulse raced. Her whole body stiffened. A shadow appeared in the doorway, and then she saw him, her husband. But something was different. His face was pale, his eyes darkened with something she couldn't read. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. Miriam opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them was suffocating. Who left the letter? His voice was cold, edged with something she couldn't place. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind reeled. Her husband knew. He knew about the letter. But how? And why was he back? Was he here to finish what had been started? He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall that neither of them could break. Who left it? He repeated, his voice sharper now, desperate. Miriam shook her head, trying to back away, but her legs felt like lead. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. I don't know, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. His eyes narrowed, searching her face, as if he could see through the fear that gripped her, as if he knew she was lying. You're lying, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I know you are. Miriam froze. She could feel the weight of his words, the accusation hanging in the air. And then, in that terrible moment, she understood. Her husband hadn't walked away from her at all. He had never left. The realization was chilling. He was the one who had sent the letter. And now, there was no escape. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet as the truth settled, like a heavy weight on her chest. Miriam's breath came in short, shallow bursts. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. He had never left. Her husband's eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. There was no comfort in them now, no love. Only a cold, sharp edge of something that made her stomach churn. You thought you could get away with it, he said, his voice so calm, so controlled. It was the calmness that terrified her. You thought you could hide everything, bury it beneath lies, but I always knew. Miriam's throat went dry. How could he have known? She had been so careful, hadn't she? She had hidden every glance, every touch, every moment that had crossed the line. But now his eyes burned through her, like he could see every secret, every dark corner she had tried to bury. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but the words got stuck in her throat. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. I was going to leave you, he continued, taking another slow step forward. But then I realized something. Miriam's legs felt weak beneath her, and she leaned against the doorframe for support, her hands shaking. I knew it wasn't over for you, he said, his voice low and cold. I knew you were still hiding something, and I needed to make sure it was clear, to make sure you knew what would happen if you kept lying. He was so close now. Too close. Miriam's body trembled as she tried to make sense of what he was saying, but the words didn't fit together. He hadn't left because of what he had found out. He had stayed for this moment. You killed him, didn't you? His eyes glinted with something dark, something terrifying. You killed my father. The accusation hit her like a slap, her mind whirling as she tried to piece together the timeline, the events. No, she hadn't killed him, not directly. She hadn't wanted that. But the knife had been in his hands when she had turned away. She had been so terrified when he lunged toward her, and her husband had intervened. But the way he looked at her now, the way he spoke, made her feel like there was no way out. The truth was slipping away from her, and she couldn't hold on to it anymore. "Miriam," he said, his voice now a dark whisper, "you were always so afraid of the consequences, of what would happen if we were found out." She didn't know how to respond. There were no more excuses, no more explanations that would make any sense. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the still bloody stain that now marked the space between them. The blood had already started to dry, and in the dim light, it looked almost black. She felt sick. "I should have let you go," he murmured, almost to himself. "But now I can't. You're mine." Her head snapped up at his words, panic surging through her veins. "What do you mean?" she gasped, her voice barely audible. He took another step forward, and she recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. "Don't pretend like you don't know," he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You've already broken everything, Miriam. You've already crossed the line." The door behind her seemed to disappear, the walls closing in on her, leaving her nowhere to run. Her mind raced, but there was only one thing that made sense. He wasn't here to forgive her. He wasn't here to help her pick up the pieces of their shattered life. He was here to finish what they had started, and there would be no escape this time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt meaningless, empty. Her husband's expression didn't change. "Sorry doesn't matter anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And before Miriam could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip so tight it sent a jolt of pain through her. "Not anymore," he repeated. Miriam felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, and for the first time, she understood. There was no turning back. The dark reality of her life had caught up with her, and in that moment, she knew that nothing, no one was going to save her. Not now. Not ever. Her pulse hammered in her throat, each beat sending a jolt of fear through her. Her wrist burned under his grip, his fingers pressing into her skin like a vice. She tried to pull away, but his hold only tightened. "Please," she whispered, barely able to find the strength to speak. "Please, let me go." But her husband didn't release her. His eyes, once filled with love and trust, were now empty, cold, and calculating. "You've had your chance," he said, his voice low, as though he were speaking to a stranger. "You've made your choices." Miriam's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was trapped, cornered in a way she hadn't imagined. This was the consequence of everything she had done, the price she had to pay for her secrets, her lies. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts as she tried to steady herself. But it was impossible. Every nerve in her body screamed for escape, yet there was nowhere to go. "I didn't." She wanted to explain herself, to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled with fear and guilt. "You didn't mean for this?" His laugh was humorless, dark. "How many times have you said that, Miriam? How many times have I heard you say that over the years?" Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't make it past the tightness in her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The world felt like it was closing in on her. He stepped forward, forcing her back against the wall. His face was inches from hers now, and she could feel his breath on her skin, cold and suffocating. "I've seen you," he whispered, voice tight with rage. "I've seen the way you looked at him. The way you let him touch you. I've watched it all, Miriam. I've known. Her head spun. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The reality of his words was too much. He had been watching her all this time, knowing the truth, waiting for this moment. Her vision blurred with tears. The house, the walls, everything around her felt like it was closing in. The darkness seemed to move, creeping from the corners of the room, threatening to consume her. I didn't want this, she whispered again, but the words felt like lies now, even to her. She had wanted it. She had let it happen. She had brought them both to this place. Her husband's eyes hardened, his jaw clenched. No, he said, his voice low, dangerous. You wanted it. You wanted him. And now you'll see what happens when you make choices like that. The air around her grew colder, the weight of his presence pressing against her. His hand moved from her wrist to her throat, tightening, making it harder to breathe. Miriam's pulse raced as the darkness closed in. She couldn't think, couldn't move. She was drowning in fear, in the crushing reality of what she had done, what she had lost. The grip on her throat tightened, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, frantic and desperate. Please, she gasped, her vision beginning to fade. Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. His expression remained unchanged. The anger, the coldness in his eyes, told her there was no mercy left. You should have thought about that before you betrayed me, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Miriam felt the edges of her vision start to blur, the pressure on her throat making it harder and harder to breathe. Her hands grasped weakly at his arm, but it felt like she was moving through water, slow and heavy. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the pressure on her throat loosened, and she gasped for air, sucking in sharp breaths. She collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her husband stood in front of her, his expression unreadable. Don't think this is over, he said, his voice cold and final. You've made your choice, Miriam, and now I will make mine. Miriam could barely process the words. Her head spun, her body trembling from the fear, from the suffocating reality of everything she had done. Her mind raced for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Not anymore. There was no way out of the mess she had made, no way to undo the damage. And in that moment, Miriam understood something terrible. She was no longer just trapped in her marriage. She was trapped in her own choices, in a web of lies, guilt, and consequences that she could never escape from. The door was open, but the way out had closed long ago. That Miriam's body felt heavy, as though the weight of her guilt, her actions, and her husband's fury had become part of the very air she breathed. Each breath felt like a struggle, a reminder of the suffocating hold of her choices. Her head was still spinning, thoughts crashing into each other, unable to make sense of anything. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but his face, his cold, unforgiving face, didn't soften. He took another step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers with a chilling intensity. You think you can hide from this? His voice was a low growl, filled with something dark, something that made her skin crawl. You think you can keep playing the victim after everything you've done? Miriam shook her head, but there were no words left to explain, no way to undo the tangled mess she had created. She wanted to beg, to plead with him to understand, but she knew it was pointless. He had seen her for what she was, for the betrayal, the lies, the broken promises. There was no redemption here, no second chances. Her pulse quickened again as her husband stepped even closer, his presence suffocating, oppressive. She could feel the anger radiating off him, like a physical force pushing her back. I gave you everything, he continued, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. And you destroyed it. For what? For him. She felt a flash of panic at the mention of his father. The guilt hit her like a wave, crashing over her with its full force. She had betrayed him with the very man who had raised him, the one person in the world she should have trusted the most. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were hollow. She couldn't even cry properly anymore. Not for him. Not for herself. Not for the wreckage they had become. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice so cold now it felt like ice in the room. "But you'll learn." Miriam couldn't move. She was frozen, her mind paralyzed by fear and regret. Then, in a flash, his hand reached out and grabbed her again, this time by the arm, pulling her towards him. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron, unyielding. "Please," she gasped, her voice shaking. "Please, just let me go." His lips twitched into a thin, humorless smile. "You think it's that easy?" he whispered, his breath hot against her face. "You think I'll just let you walk away? After everything you've done?" He pushed her toward the wall, not gently, but with a force that left her breathless. "No," he growled. "You'll face the consequences. You'll feel the weight of this. You'll understand why there's no escape." Miriam's heart pounded harder than ever. She could see the darkness in his eyes now, something far more dangerous than she had ever realized. In the moment between them, there was no love, no empathy. There was only anger and betrayal, swirling together like a storm. She could feel the panic rising in her throat. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Trapped in a house of lies, her marriage shattered, and the person she had once trusted the most now turned into something unrecognizable? Her hands were shaking, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. And then, as though sensing her vulnerability, he took a deep breath, stepping back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. "I'm not going to kill you, Miriam," he said, his voice quieter now, but the coldness still in it. "I'm going to make you live with this, with what you've done." The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had never truly understood what he was capable of, what this man, her husband, could do when pushed to the edge. Miriam stood there, trembling, as the weight of his words settled in. He wasn't going to let her die. He was going to make her suffer. She wanted to scream, to protest, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't even find the strength to move. All she could do was watch him, knowing that whatever happened next would seal her fate. The choices she had made, the lies she had told, the betrayal that had destroyed everything, it had all led to this moment. There was no escape. And now Miriam understood. She had already lost. The silence between them stretched longer, suffocating and thick with tension. Miriam could feel her body trembling, the weight of her husband's words settling deep in her bones. She wanted to protest, to deny everything he was saying, but the truth lingered in the air like a foul stench, undeniable. Her eyes wandered to the door, but she knew it was useless. She had nowhere to run, no way out. The walls of this house had become a prison, and the man standing before her held the keys. "You're going to live with this," he repeated, his voice quieter now, as if savoring the moment. "Live with the shame, the guilt. And every time you look in the mirror, you'll remember what you did." Miriam could feel her heart racing. She had thought, no, she had hoped there was some small chance for forgiveness, that somehow everything could be undone. But there was no undoing this. No second chances. The truth had already come out, and the consequences were inevitable. His words pierced her like 1,000 daggers. She could see him standing there, the man she had once loved, now a stranger, someone unrecognizable, consumed by anger and betrayal. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her mind raced, thoughts spinning in a blur, but all she could feel was the cold emptiness of her actions. Every moment of her life had led her here, to this unbearable point of reckoning. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt hollow, like a cry in the dark. He didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, his gaze hard, calculating. Then, without warning, he stepped closer again, closing the distance between them, his hand reaching out, brushing the hair from her face. The tenderness of the gesture took her by surprise, but it was not out of love. It was cold, calculated, as if he were inspecting his work. "You don't deserve my pity," he said softly, but there was something almost cruel in his tone. "You're not the woman I thought you were." She flinched, the words stinging more than she could have anticipated. Her body trembled, a quiet sob escaping her throat before she could stop it. Her chest tightened, the pain of her actions now a physical weight crushing her. She had betrayed him. She had destroyed their love, and now there was nothing left but the wreckage. "Please," she whispered again, the word fragile, almost broken. "Please don't do this. Don't make me live with this. I'll do anything." But her husband just looked at her, the coldness in his eyes unyielding. "There's nothing you can do now, Miriam," he said, his voice low and emotionless. "The damage is done." The words hung in the air, final, unchangeable. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the tension seemed to snap. He stepped away, turning toward the door, not even looking back at her. Miriam watched him, her breath shallow, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The moment stretched on, as though time itself had frozen, holding its breath. He reached for the door handle. "Miriam," he said without turning around, "you've already ruined your life, but you'll live with that forever." He opened the door, stepping into the hallway, leaving her standing there, alone in the silence. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She could feel the tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She couldn't. Miriam stood in the center of the room, numb. Her chest ached with the weight of her guilt, but there was no relief in sight. She had destroyed everything, her marriage, her sense of self, everything she had ever held dear. The door clicked shut behind him, and she was left with only the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. The weight of his words pressed down on her. She was alone now, and she would be alone forever. The consequences of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life, never letting her forget. And as she stood there in the silence of the house, she understood. There was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. Miriam stood frozen, her body numb, as the silence settled heavily around her. She could still hear the faint sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall, his presence now nothing more than an echo. Her fingers, trembling uncontrollably, clutched the edges of the wall, her only anchor in the vast emptiness of the room. The words he had spoken echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain. "You've already ruined your life, asterisk, you'll live with that. Forever, asterisk." Her throat tightened, the weight of those words squeezing the air from her lungs. She tried to move, to break free from the suffocating grip of guilt that wrapped around her chest. But her body wouldn't obey. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was paralyzed, trapped in her own mind, stuck in a nightmare that wouldn't end. What now? The thought came unbidden, but it didn't bring comfort. What was left for her now? What did she have after everything had been torn apart? She had been foolish to think there was any escape, any redemption. There was no returning from this. The lies had piled up, and now they were her prison. She sank to her knees, her hands resting on the cold floor, the rough surface grounding her as everything else spun out of control. The house felt like a tomb now, its walls closing in on her, its silence deafening. The weight of her betrayal, the cruelty of her actions, crushed her under its force. Her mind flickered to the night everything had changed, to the decisions she had made, to the first moment when she had allowed herself to be swept away by a temptation she had known was dangerous. Her heart twisted at the memory of him, her father-in-law, the man she had betrayed her husband with. And then the final, horrific realization, the way things had ended. She could still see the bloodstain on the floor, could still feel the cold steel of the knife in her trembling hand, even though it had all happened so quickly. Her husband had seen it all. He had been watching, waiting, knowing. The silence in the room grew more oppressive. The house that had once been a home, a place of refuge, now felt like a cage. She pulled herself to her feet, her knees weak, her mind numb. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, but she couldn't bear to look at it for long. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable, her face pale, her eyes hollow, haunted by the choices she had made. She had betrayed everything, and now she was left with nothing. As she turned away from the mirror, her eyes scanned the room, once familiar, now alien. It was all wrong. Nothing felt right anymore. The reality of what had happened pressed down on her with suffocating force. The weight of her husband's betrayal, the one she had never seen coming, and her own actions had sealed her fate. She had thought she could control everything, could keep her secrets hidden, but now the truth was all that remained. Her gaze shifted toward the door, the one her husband had exited through. She couldn't go after him. She knew that now. The door had closed behind him, and with it, any hope she had left. There was no reconciliation, no chance for forgiveness. There was only the cold, hard truth. She had destroyed her life, and there was no undoing it. Her legs gave way again, and she collapsed onto the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tears came now, not in great sobs, but in a slow, steady stream, each one a reflection of the pain and regret that consumed her. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the darkness of her own mind, before she finally realized she couldn't stay here anymore. She couldn't stay in this house, with the echoes of what had happened, with the suffocating weight of everything she had done. Miriam stood slowly, wiping the tears from her face, feeling every movement as if it were in slow motion. She walked to the window, her hand resting against the cold glass, looking out at the night. The darkness outside seemed endless, like a reflection of the void inside her. There was no path forward, no road to redemption. Her world had collapsed, and now all she could do was watch the pieces fall apart. Miriam knew deep down that the life she had known was over. There was no going back. And as she stood there, staring into the blackness, she knew that the nightmare was only just beginning. Miriam stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as the cold night air seeped in through the cracks. The world outside was dark, just as the one within her had become. The silence in the house was deafening now, broken only by the sound of her own breathing, sharp and shallow, as though she were fighting against something that would pull her under. Her reflection in the glass was distorted, like the image of someone she no longer recognized. A woman who had once known love, trust, and comfort, now standing in the wreckage of her choices. The face staring back at her seemed alien. Empty eyes, a tightness in her expression, a stillness that could never be undone. She wanted to scream, to shatter the glass, to scream at the sky, to somehow release the pressure building inside her chest. But she didn't. The moment felt suffocating, too heavy to move through. She couldn't tell if it was the guilt that made her feel like she was drowning, or the overwhelming realization that there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Her thoughts drifted again to that night, the night everything had fallen apart, the moment she had made that first mistake, thinking she could get away with it, thinking it would remain hidden forever. But it hadn't. Nothing stayed hidden, not for long. The worst part was she hadn't even been looking for the affair. It had happened gradually, like a slow, insidious pull she couldn't resist. At first, it was innocent words, small gestures. And then, the weight of the guilt hadn't hit her. The moment of passion had seemed like the only way to escape the pressures of her life, of her marriage. But now, standing here in the aftermath, she saw the truth for what it was: selfishness. Her own desires had drowned out everything else. The door slammed in the distance, her husband's presence still lingering in the corners of her mind. His absence felt final, as though the last thread between them had snapped, unraveling the entire fabric of their life together. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in the endless expanse of night outside. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, consuming her, and yet the weight inside her heart grew heavier with each passing second. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table, breaking the silence. Miriam didn't move at first. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know who it was or what they wanted. She was done with it all. But the phone kept vibrating insistently until she finally walked over to it. Her hands shook as she picked it up, her thumb hovering over the screen. For a moment, she thought about throwing it across the room, letting it shatter like everything else in her life. But instead, she unlocked it, her heart sinking as she saw the message that had been sent. It was a text from an unknown number, but the words were chilling. Asterisk, you think you've gotten away with it? You're wrong. He's not the only one watching you, asterisk. Her blood ran cold, the room around her spinning. She reread the message, her eyes scanning it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who was this? Her first instinct was to delete it, to pretend she had never seen it. But something stopped her, something deep in her gut that told her this wasn't over. The message had come from someone who knew more than they should. It was clear now. The lies, the betrayal, everything had reached beyond her husband and father-in-law. There were more eyes on her. Miriam felt the walls of her world closing in once again. The house felt even smaller, more oppressive. She could almost feel the eyes on her, watching her every move, following her every step. Her hands began to tremble, a wave of panic surging through her body. She didn't know who had sent the message. She didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore. She had no control. No safe place left. The phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. Another message. Another warning. Asterisk, you're not safe. Not anymore, asterisk. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, paralyzed by fear. The air seemed to thicken, closing in on her as the weight of the truth crushed down harder than ever. She had destroyed everything, her marriage, her dignity, and now it seemed the shadows had come to collect. And Miriam knew in that instant that the nightmare was only just beginning. Miriam's hands shook as she stared at the phone, the screen dimming as the words from the unknown number burned into her mind. Asterisk, you're not safe. Not anymore, asterisk. Her heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears like a heavy drumbeat. She felt the walls of the room close in, the air thickening with an intensity she couldn't escape. She glanced around, as if expecting to see someone in the shadows, lurking just out of view. Her pulse raced with a terrifying mix of fear and confusion. Who was watching her? Who else knew? She had no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply by the second. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she began pacing around the room, trying to calm herself, but her mind was spiraling. Her hands trembled as she typed a reply, her fingers stiff and clumsy on the screen. Who is this? She sent, the words feeling feeble in the face of the growing dread she felt. There was no immediate response. She waited, each second stretching like an eternity. A soft ping sounded. She stared at the phone, her eyes narrowing. Another message. Asterisk, you think you can hide your sins? They'll catch up with you. Everyone pays the price, asterisk. Her blood ran cold again. The words were a dark promise, a warning that gnawed at her soul. What had she done? What had she truly brought upon herself? There was no escaping this. There was no way out. Miriam dropped the phone onto the table, her hands trembling uncontrollably now. She had thought that by silencing the people in her life, by keeping the affair hidden, she had control. But the truth was that the very secrets she had tried to bury were coming back to haunt her, and they would never let her forget. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open, startling her. She spun around, heart in her throat, but no one was there. The house was empty, or so she thought. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, reached her ears. Her mind raced, desperately trying to understand what was happening. Was it her husband? Had he returned? Or was it someone else? Someone who knew the truth. Her body froze, rooted to the spot. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She felt her chest tighten, her breath hitching in her throat. She took a tentative step back, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The dark shadow at the edge of the hallway seemed to move, an ominous presence that made her heart race. She couldn't tell whether it was her mind playing tricks on her or if someone really was there, but the fear that gripped her was all too real. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and the air grew even heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Miriam's gaze darted around, searching for anything she could use to defend herself, anything to break the stillness. The knife, the one she had used in desperation the night it all began, lay on the kitchen counter. But it was too far. Her hand trembled at her side as she clutched the edge of the table for support. Another step, then another. Someone was right there, just on the other side of the door. Miriam opened her mouth to call out, but no words came. She was paralyzed by fear, her throat dry, her voice stolen by the terror that had taken root inside her. And then, with a soft click, the door creaked open. Her breath caught as a figure stepped inside, blocking the threshold. It wasn't her husband. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadow. He stood still for a moment, his presence suffocating the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The cold, deliberate way he looked at her spoke volumes. He wasn't here for a conversation. He was here to finish something. Miriam's mind raced, her body trembling, but she couldn't look away from his eyes. Cold, calculating, knowing. "Who are you?" she whispered, the words barely a breath. The man's lips twisted into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll know soon enough," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The door behind him slammed shut, leaving Miriam with nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And in that moment she knew she was no longer in control. There was no one coming to save her. The nightmare had only just begun. The man's presence was like a shadow that stretched across the room, swallowing any light that had remained. Miriam's breath quickened, her chest tightening as she struggled to process the reality of the situation. She had no idea who this man was, but something deep inside her told her that he was no stranger to the mess she had made. His eyes never left hers, cold and unfeeling. A sense of dread, suffocating and absolute, filled the room. The space between them seemed to grow even smaller, as though the walls themselves were closing in. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. The man took a slow, deliberate step forward, his footfalls echoing in the silence. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he surveyed her with a look that made her feel as if he could see into the very depths of her soul. Miriam's heart raced, her mind spinning. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Suddenly, the man spoke, his voice a quiet hiss. "You've been a very careless woman, Miriam. You thought you could hide your secrets, but they were always waiting for you. And now," his voice trailed off, and a cruel smirk twisted at the corners of his lips. "Now you'll pay." The words sank into her skin like ice, cold and unforgiving. She felt the weight of them, like a noose slowly tightening around her neck. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, the panic rising as the room seemed to constrict further. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was trapped, cornered in the very place she had once considered her safe haven. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The man took another step toward her, the distance between them now almost non-existent. Miriam's body trembled, her mind screaming at her to move, to fight, to do anything. But she couldn't. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, barely a plea. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The man's eyes flickered briefly with something that could have been amusement, but the moment passed quickly, replaced with an emptiness that made Miriam's blood run cold. "You should have thought of that before," he said, his voice smooth, almost indifferent. Without another word, he reached into his coat, pulling something from inside. Miriam's heart skipped a beat as she saw the flash of metal, a knife, gleaming in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same weapon, the same one she had used so many months ago, the one that had sealed her fate. She stumbled back, but her legs were weak, her body betraying her. She could feel the coldness of the floor against her skin as she hit the ground. "Please, please don't," she begged, her voice breaking as the tears began to well up in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I've suffered enough. Don't do this." The man didn't respond. He simply took one more step forward, the knife glinting in his hand, his eyes as empty as ever. Miriam closed her eyes, the panic surging, and for the briefest of moments, she felt a fleeting hope. Maybe he wouldn't do it. Maybe this was all just a threat, a game to him. But as she opened her eyes again, she saw the truth, the finality of it all. And in that moment, she realized there was no redemption, no escape, no forgiveness. Her sins, her choices had led her here, and there was no turning back. The knife descended, swift and unforgiving, and everything went dark. The cold steel of the knife gleamed in the dim light, and Miriam's heart pounded in her chest as she closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She had come so far, down a path she had chosen, filled with mistakes and regrets. But now, in this moment, she realized how far she had fallen. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Every second stretched into eternity. The man was still standing there, unmoving, his presence hanging over her like a storm waiting to break. But then something shifted. The man paused, his hand still gripping the knife, but no longer advancing. The silence grew even deeper, and for a moment, Miriam could feel the weight of his gaze on her, reading her every fear, every broken piece of her soul. The knife slowly lowered, and the tension in the room shifted. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. She dared not move, not wanting to provoke him, but at the same time, she couldn't help but wonder what was happening. The man's voice was quieter this time, less certain, though still laced with something dark. "You've lost everything, Miriam. There's nothing left to take." Miriam felt a flicker of something. Was it relief? Or just disbelief? The weight of the situation, the grimness of it all, had been so overwhelming she hadn't allowed herself to imagine a way out. But now, standing there in the quiet, she realized something. Even though everything she knew was destroyed, she was still here, alive. "You think I'll let you walk away from this?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. But there was no malice in his tone now, only a kind of tired resignation. Miriam took a shaky breath, gathering whatever strength she had left. "I've paid for my sins. I can't change what I've done, but I still have to live with it." The man regarded her quietly, the knife still in his hand but no longer threatening. For a moment, she saw something else in his eyes, something like understanding, perhaps even pity. And then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The room seemed to expand as his figure receded into the darkness. Miriam remained motionless, staring at the spot where he had stood. The air felt lighter now, as though the heavy weight of the moment had finally lifted, but it left a cold emptiness behind. She slowly rose to her feet, the tremors in her legs still there, but lessened. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in her thoughts, processing everything that had happened. It felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't fully wake from. But the reality of it all began to settle in. Her life had been torn apart. Her choices had led her here, and she couldn't undo any of it. She had lost so much. Yet, as she stood in the stillness, she realized something she hadn't before. She was still breathing. She was still alive, and maybe that was all she could hold on to now. Miriam looked out the window again, the first light of dawn creeping into the sky. It wasn't a bright, joyful sunrise, but it was a new day, and that in itself felt like a small victory. One step at a time, that's all she could do now. With a deep, shaky breath, she walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that redemption, if it was ever to come, would be something she would have to seek within herself.